in American Studies. Owen is the director of Finding the Maryland 400, a research project studying the First Maryland Regiment. He is the author of Maryland's Jews, Military Service in the American Revolutionary Era, the Case of Elias Pollock, an article which appeared in the Journal of Southern Jewish History and is currently at work on a social history of the Maryland line, chronicling the soldiers of the Maryland 400 during the Revolutionary War. This is a topic I told Owen he launched into my mind. We did a dedication of a marker for Norman Bruce, and when he spoke, I was like, I've got to find out about the Maryland 400. So I'm so excited to hear him talk about this. So please, everybody, welcome Owen.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Laura, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm very grateful to the Carroll 250 and to Lisa and the staff here at the Continental Library. It's really nice to be out here. One of the things that I think about when I talk about the Revolutionary War in Maryland, sometimes it's hard because the war doesn't really happen in Maryland. There's some raids along the Potomac, and there's some fighting in the Bay and around the Eastern Shore. But in terms of actual British regulars, they marched through Cecil County in the summer of 1777, and that's really about it. And that can sometimes make it hard to really get people to identify with what's going on. One of the things that really gets people's attention when you're talking about history is stuff that happened where they live. And that can be a little bit hard with the Revolutionary War. One of the ways that I think we're able to sort of overcome that, and one of the things that I really like so much about the work that we've done at the State Archives, is we're focusing on the individual soldiers. Not just the battle, not just the generals, not people you've heard of. And when you think about it, this is something that ordinary people who lived here in Taneytown did. And I think it has a way of making this a local event rather than something that happens out of state. This is a project which I and State Archives have been working on since 2013. That is for a really long time now. It is something that we have been doing in conjunction with a lot of support from the Maryland Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. So I know there are some SAR members here. So I'll take the opportunity to thank you for your help over the years. It's nice. Sometimes I find myself as the only person in the room who knows and really cares about the Maryland 400 and about the Maryland line. So I know that's not true tonight. So we're going to talk about the Battle of Brooklyn, sometimes called the Battle of Long Island. It's fought in August of 1776, about 6 weeks after the Declaration of Independence has been signed. It is the largest battle in the American Revolution in terms of troop size. And it is a catastrophic defeat for the Americans. There are not many things that could have gone worse for the way the battle turns out. And we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of the battle a little bit later on. The only thing that goes well, and the only reason the battle isn't the last battle of the American Revolution, is that a little group of soldiers from Maryland, and some men from Pennsylvania and from Delaware, worked their way in between a large British army and the retreating American army. And it holds them off for a while. We don't really know why they do this. It's easy to say that they were gallantly sacrificing themselves to save their comrades in arms. We don't really know if that's true. No one says that they did this with the intent of buying time to cover the retreat. But we know it has that effect, and I think that's really important. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about the things that make this last stand as remarkable as it was. This group of soldiers is who we now call the Maryland 400. Maryland 400 is actually a Victorian-era term. It's not a term that they used at the time. It leaves the Marylanders taking heavy casualties. They lose 256 either killed or captured, and that's out of a group of about 1,000 soldiers. So they lose about 25% of their men, which is enormous losses. So we should start with a couple basic things. If you only remember one thing from tonight, it is that the Maryland 400, the name is wrong. There were not 400 of them. As I've said, there were 1,000 soldiers from Maryland there. The name's origins are a little obscure. There are a couple of possibilities. I think it's probably a mix of all of these. depending on how you do the math, you could say that there were 400 soldiers who took part from Maryland who took part in that last stand, which is sort of almost true. The other thing we know is that this is a term which comes into use around the 1890s, around the same time as Lady Astor's 400. So the listing of the most exclusive members of New York City's high society in the Gilded Age. That list was published around the same time. And we know that there are at least some explicit references in Maryland of people saying, well, in New York they have their 400, who's all these rich people. But in Maryland we have our 400 who saved the revolution for them. We know of that 1,000 soldiers, we can identify about 870 of them. We use muster rolls, we use pay records, we use pension files, correspondence, bits of letters here and there. There are some gaps in all of the muster rolls, but we've been able to put together a pretty good group of how many there were. We don't know exactly how many there were because the Maryland Regiment and the Continental Army in general wasn't very good yet at that sort of administrative side. I work in the government archives, so how the government creates paper records and how they take care of them. It's very interesting to me. It's one of these things where, on one hand, it's kind of an irrelevant detail that they hadn't had a chance to do a strength return, and we don't know how many of them there were. But I think it also speaks to some of the unreadiness about the Americans. In the summer of 1776, similar, I would think, to the summer of 1861, the Americans, both in the Army and out of the Army, are incredibly enthusiastic, and they are sure that because they are virtuous freemen, they're going to beat the British easily. And they don't. They have no idea what they're in for. There's hardly anybody in America with real military experience. There's the small number of soldiers who fought in Massachusetts and a little bit of partisan fighting in the South. Among the Marylanders, there are 5, we think, who had any military experience before. And it's likely that none of them had actually been in combat before. Most of their experience had been limited to marching. So for many years, when we talked about the Maryland 400, if they were remembered at all, they were remembered as a group. But they've remained mostly anonymous as individuals. And there are plenty of people who are part of that who go on to long and famous careers. William Smallwood ends the war as a major general. He's the highest ranking Marylander in the Continental Army. He's a governor of Maryland, a fairly important one as these things go. John Hoskins Stone is also governor. There are senators and congressmen, dozens of state legislators, 2 state treasurers. Many of the senior militia commanders in the War of 1812 fought during the Revolution. 3 of Maryland's first 4 adjutants general were part of this group. So it's an illustrious group of people. We shouldn't lose sight of that. But I think it's also important that it's not just those guys. In fact, that if you take those guys away, you still got most of the regiment is still there. And so we've been working to figure out who they were, to identify them, first of all, and then to find out what we can about their lives. Find out who were their wives, did they have children, did they have trades, were they farmers, were they common laborers? The answer is yes, there are some of all of these people. And we want to look at what they do, how they're affected by some of the larger trends in history, so that when the economy bottoms out in the 1780s, what happens to these soldiers? How many of them find their way to Kentucky or to Ohio looking for land because it's hard to get land in Maryland? And maybe your father has land, but when he dies, you can't subdivide your 80-acre tract, and so you're out of luck and you got to move on.
Still that way in Maryland.
In the course of our work, we've uncovered some really wonderful and touching stories about these people. But to begin with, before we get to the individuals, I show you some more of our famous folks. Before we get to the individuals, let's talk about who these are, who the ordinary soldiers are as a group. Here is our lovely portrait of the Maryland soldiers departing from Annapolis, July 9th, 1776. is a wonderful painting. It is completely wrong. Nothing like this at all happened. For one thing, they wouldn't have had their lovely blue uniforms on yet for another year or two. And it also wouldn't have made sense for anyone to be on horseback because they left Annapolis by boat. Nevertheless, it's a lovely painting, and I will use it whenever I have a chance to. A small asterisk. So let's imagine that you're there. Let's imagine you're in Annapolis in the summer of 1776. What's it like? Well, for one thing, you're overwhelmed by the number of soldiers there are. The city of Annapolis had a population of somewhere around 1,000 in 1776, and there are easily 1,000 soldiers. There are probably more than that, training in the fields around town, sleeping in the fields, sleeping in any available houses in the town. And just imagine you've doubled the size of the city's population, mostly with single young men, many of whom are away from home for the first time, and probably most of whom are away from their family for the first time, even if they've been out of town before. As I said, among them, there are only a handful who have any military experience. Two of them, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Ware, who's the second in command, and Captain Barton Lucas from Prince George's County, had been young junior officers in the French and Indian War. They saw some combat in 1758, which is a long time ago by this point. There are a couple of others who may or may not have been part of the rifle companies who come out of Frederick County in 1775. And one of the drum major for the regiment had been a sergeant in the British Army, and it's all we know about him, but he'd done some sort of British service. So they march out under the command of William Smallwood. There he is on his horse. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong one, slide. They march out under the command of William Smallwood, and the soldiers themselves are all men. But it's a mistake to think of this regiment or any other regiment in the Revolution as being only a group of men. The best way to think of what the Continental Army was, and the British Army for that matter, is to think of it as a holistic family where there are women and there are children, and they are traveling with the Army. They are providing important services that the Army doesn't. They're cooking food, they're sewing clothing, they're doing laundry, they're acting as nurses, they're selling supplies. And they're there as a matter of simple economic necessity. The family can't afford the loss of the man's income while he's in the service. And it's not as though he's being paid and can send his salary back home, because he's not getting paid, of course. And it's hard to operate a household as a woman by yourself in the 18th century. Running your house is backbreaking all day work. You can't also run your farm at the same time. Colonel Josiah Carville Hall, who's a colonel of the 4th Maryland Regiment, he explains the problem in 1779. A soldier's pay will not enable him to maintain a family at home, which compels him to bring them with his regiment, where they may share his rations, though they are little enough for himself. This frequently subjects the brave soldier to punishment by so powerfully interfering with his military duty, and besides, greatly encumbers the march of the army. The experience of these inconveniences prevents the most considerate and best of our soldiers from reenlisting. He says this in 1779, when most of the enlistments in the Maryland line are about to expire. So he knows what he's talking about. He sees what the problem is. We're not sure very much about the status of women and children traveling with the man in 1776, with this group. We know that later on that fall, Margaret Jane Ramsey, who's the wife of Nathaniel Ramsey, the captain of the 5th Company, and also the sister of noted painter Charles Wilson Peale and James Peale. James Peale is also an officer in this regiment. She attends with them. After the Battle of Brooklyn, she reads the reports and decides that she would rather be with the Army, whatever her sufferings, than be at a distance and so much tormented. For if she was near the Army, in case of misfortunes, she might possibly be able to help those most dear to her. The soldiers are young. It's not a surprise. And the country itself has a fairly young population. But I think the youth of them, this thing is still a little bit striking. So the average age is about 24 or 25. The American-born tend to be a little bit younger. The immigrants tend to be a little bit on the older side. And there are a handful of men in their 40s, one who's at least one who's in their young teens. But to me, it's the officer corps where the youth really stands out. Daniel Bowie is either 20 or 21 when he's made a captain commanding a company. William Sterrett and William Fraser were 19-year-old lieutenants Nathaniel Ramsey was 35, which is what you would expect for a captain, but his junior officers were 18 and 22. And the junior officers end up with a lot of the command because so many of the soldiers are sick, as we'll talk about. They end up actually leaving their company. So William Sterritt is 19 in his first battle, and he leads his company in the fight. And the men who go north to New York with Smallwood in 76, they're almost certainly all white. But it's hard to say for sure because for perhaps the only time in 18th century Maryland, they don't record people's race. Makes it a little bit hard to determine who they are. We know that every other regiment that Maryland raises in the Revolution is integrated, that there are black soldiers. They are serving alongside the white soldiers. They are not in segregated units. They are not just performing work as teamsters or things like that. It is the last time the American Army is integrated until 1948. But the Maryland line, as we know, is at least 3.5% black in the middle of the war. It's the only time where we really have numbers. At least in other states, the black soldiers tend to serve longer than the white soldiers did.
Owen, excuse me.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Maryland line several times and also the Maryland State Militia. Are they different entities? Or?
Sure. So the militia, who we are actually really not going to deal with very much today, the militia are people who stay at home. They are typically, it's the adult, able-bodied male population, white male population of the county. Their job is home defense, guarding strategic points in town. Periodically, militia units from Maryland do get activated, and some see active service. When I say Maryland line, sorry, that is a phrase I should have specified. That refers to all of the Maryland soldiers as a group, so the collective term for them. In 1776, Maryland has 1.5 regiments. Later on in the war, they have 7. So when you think of them, they call them as a line because when they're all ready to fight, they are standing in a line. We don't know, so as I was saying, we don't think there are any black soldiers in this group of troops. It is the first soldiers that Maryland enlists, or that Maryland raises in the war. And I think essentially they didn't need black soldiers. Maryland as a society is terrified at the idea of arming and giving military training to black people. They think it's about the worst idea you could have. One of the reasons Maryland raises militia soldiers in 1776 is because they're afraid that the enslaved population will rise up against them. So we don't think there are any black soldiers in this group. There's a decent chance that there are some enslaved servants who are traveling with these people. It is hard to imagine some of these officers from the highest ranks of Maryland society traveling without enslaved servants to work with them. They leave on July 10th. They make their trip up to New York. They go by boat to Head of Elk, or to Elkton, where the companies that had been scattered across the state all come together. They make their way to Philadelphia, more or less marching along the route of I-95, about 15 or 20 miles a day. They get pretty good weather for this part of the trip. It takes them about a week to get to Philadelphia, where William Sands, a 19-year-old sergeant from Annapolis, he takes a moment to write a letter back home to his parents, John and Ann Sands, with news of their journey. Sands' dispatch from the march is one of the only reports that we have about the trip, and it's certainly the only one we have from an ordinary soldier. The letter he writes on July 20th, just as they're leaving Philadelphia, it feels to me like a report from somebody off on an adventure. He's a teenager. This may not be his first trip away from home, but it's almost certainly the first time he's been away from his parents and from the authority of his parents. And it feels like an adventure. He passes on news to his parents of a family friend. He looks somebody up in Philadelphia who sends their regards. And he also makes a reference to some unknown women seeking to reassure his parents that he's very sorry anybody should raise such false reports. The girl is not in company with me. She's along with the soldiers in the barracks with 5 more women. I have nothing to say to her, and I hope you'll not think any more of it. We would love to know more about what this story is. It evidently refers to the sort of women who will stay in the barracks with the troops. Otherwise, he writes, as for news, I have none to acquaint you of, but that we expect to go from here to New York tomorrow, and when we get to camp, I shall write. We are in good spirits. 3 weeks later, they finally made it through New York and were slogging their way through New Jersey. And the second letter he writes back to his parents, he keeps his word. And the tone is just so different to me that he's giving some clear-eyed updates on the military situation. I think something has clicked for him, but as he gets to New York, he has a different idea of what's happening. He talks about how the men are encamped, talks about how many of them there are. He says that the British have been landing troops who keep coming by the dozens, that they keep trying to sail ships up the Hudson River past the American defenses. Yesterday, he says the enemy had a reinforcement of that damned rascal Dunmore's fleet, as we expect. There was about 40 sail. So this is Lord Dunmore, the colonial governor of Virginia, who has raised a regiment of fugitive enslaved people who have come here to fight. Sands continued, "We are ordered to hold ourselves in readiness. We expect an attack hourly. We have lost a good many of our troops. They have deserted from us at Philadelphia and Elizabethtown in New Jersey, and a great many are sick in the hospital. There is rations given out at New York for 6,000 men daily, and it's probably 2 or 3 times that many. I should be glad if you will write me at the first opportunity and let me know the news, if there is any, in that part of the country. We expect, please God, to winter in Annapolis, those that live of us." The battle that Sands anticipated comes 2 weeks later on August 27th. At the time that the battle begins, the Americans, this is where we start to see things fall apart for the Americans. The first problem that happens is they don't know how to run a camp. There are so few people within the American military establishment that they don't understand the proper way to organize and maintain an army camp. Any large collection of people in the 18th century is going to be a breeding ground for disease. There's going to be typhus, there's going to be all sorts of other things going around. But in addition, they are unable to keep the water supply away from the latrines. So dysentery runs rampant through the ranks. And this isn't just a footnote. Within the Maryland unit, within the Maryland Regiment, there are plenty of people sick, including a number of officers. But even worse, the American general who has command over the portion of New York where the battle happens, he is sick and so ill, he can't even explain to Washington what his plans for defense were. And so Washington and one of the other generals, they ride out to this piece of Long Island, trying to figure out what the idea was. And they kind of figured it out, but they really still don't know. The other thing that happens is the American command can't really figure out what the British are doing or where they are. So the Marylanders, they get to New York, they join an army of somewhere around 10,000 men. The British have been arriving in dribs and drabs for much of the summer, and by July and August, they have about 20,000 men who they've landed the southern end of Long Island near Brooklyn, close to where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is, if your New York geography is better than mine. The Americans aren't quite sure what's going on. There's a lot of thought that this is a diversion because they don't know how many soldiers are really there. They can't get good intelligence because most of the people who live on Long Island have loyalist tendencies and are not particularly interested in helping the rebel army. So it's not until August 26th that the Americans finally figure out that this is actually the whole of the British Army, and this is really where they have landed all their men and where they're going to attack from. At this point, George Washington has convened a court-martial. There's a colonel who they have caught trying to sell secrets to the British. Washington wants to have a court-martial, cashier him, and just be done with the matter. And so to have a court-martial for a high-ranking officer, you need other high-ranking officers. And so Washington pulls the colonels, the commanders of the Maryland Regiment. He picks the top 2 officers in the Maryland Regiment. He picks the colonel who leads the Delaware Regiment, all these soldiers. And as they're having this court-martial, Washington is determined to finish it. They begin deploying soldiers from Manhattan across the river into Long Island, into what was now Brooklyn. And Washington is so determined to maintain his court-martial, to finish it, that he doesn't allow the officers to go with their soldiers. By the time Washington finally pauses the trial, it's too late for them to join the soldiers in the fight. And so Smallwood and the others watch this from the heights above the battlefield, and they're just beside themselves. Smallwood writes later that he is outraged at Washington, and he won't do this. This is one of these moments where we see Washington still trying to get comfortable, still trying to figure out what it means to be a general. As a result, because Maryland's top 2 officers are still in Manhattan at a military trial, when the Marylanders go across the East River, they're led by this gentleman, our local hero, Mordecai Gist. Gist has no actual military experience. In 1774, he organized a private militia company which spent a year or 2 parading through the streets of Baltimore, harassing Tories. They escort Washington when he comes through town. And so while Gist has experience being in a group of soldiers, he certainly has no relevant military experience to what's about to happen. Nevertheless, he is ready for the job. He's very active. The Battle of Brooklyn, we're really fortunate that there are a number of firsthand accounts from the Maryland soldiers, which means that you don't have to listen to me describe it. We can have the soldiers who are there do the work for us. So we begin with Gist. So let's do a quick orientation to where we are. So you are seeing the Hudson River. I would point at this with my pointer, but it won't show up on the screen. So we have the Hudson River. The blue soldiers, there's a line of thin blue soldiers. These folks, those are the Americans. The Marylanders are the group who I've highlighted in blue. So they are the extreme right of the American line. There's nobody next to them. There's water next to them. And it puts them in a very important position. It means that they have to hold that position no matter what, pretty much, or the entire line will collapse. The British land down here, near where it says Staten Island. If you look here closely, you can see that there are a little group of ships who have been drawn there. So they land here, and they deploy their soldiers out across the battlefield. As Gist says, we began our march to the right side of the battlefield about 3 o'clock in the morning with about 1,300 men, so from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. At about sunrise, we discovered the enemy. One of the soldiers in the 5th Company, we're not sure who he is, but he's almost certainly an officer. He writes, "The enemy advanced towards us, upon which Lord Stirling, who's the American general commanding this group, immediately drew us up in a line and offered them battle in the true English taste. The British Army then advanced within 300 yards of us and began a very heavy fire from their cannons and mortars, for both the balls and the shells flew very fast, now and then taking off ahead. Our men stood it amazingly well. Not even one of them showed a disposition to shrink. Our orders were not to fire until the enemy came within 50 yards of us," which, if you think about that, that is a difficult task. "When the British perceived we stood their fire so coolly and resolutely, they declined coming any nearer, although they were treble our number. In this situation we stood from sunrise until 12 o'clock, the enemy firing upon us the chief part of the time." As far as William McMillan, who's a 20-year-old corporal from Hartford County, who says, "We had a pretty severe fight with the Jaegers, who are Hessian soldiers. It was a draw battle. There was a good many on each side killed. They retreated, and we did not pursue them." Gist said, "Our men behaved well and maintained their ground until the enemy retreated about 200 yards and halted, and the firing on each side ceased." So the British pull back. The Marylanders feel that they have weathered their first test as soldiers. They have faced the enemy. They have faced not just hardened soldiers, but they faced some of the most feared Hessian troops fighting with the British, and the enemy have backed down. And there are cheers that are heard along the line. And the problem is that this is only a diversion. The reason the British didn't pursue this attack is because they didn't need to. Because the real battle is happening somewhere else. They have slipped around the other side, to the left side of the American line, under the cover of darkness, marched down a road which the Americans have guarded by tradition with 4 men on horseback because they forgot about it, and have surrounded the Americans. 18th century warfare, the real goal is to surround your enemies, outflank them, and then they will collapse. You can push them off the battlefield. And that's more or less what happens. So you can see so the march of the British, they go along this road out to here, and then they have surrounded the Americans. The worst of the fighting, and the Americans begin to retreat over there pretty hastily. What happens on the Maryland side, on the Marylander side of the battlefield, is actually a little bit more relaxed, a little bit calmer. The enemy, sorry, page off. The main body of their army, by a route we had never dreamed of, had entirely surrounded us and scattered all of our men, except the Delaware and Maryland battalions. As McMillan said, we were surrounded by Hielanders, so the Scottish Highland troops. McMillan himself is Scottish, so he knows what he's talking about. Hielanders on one side, Hessians on the other. Gist said, being thus surrounded with no probability of reinforcement, his lordship ordered me to retreat with the remaining part of our men and force our way through to our camp. So they're going to try to get their way back to the fortified American lines at the back of the end of the battlefield. They know that if they get there, they will be more or less safe, at least for a little while. So try to imagine what this is. There have been fighting for several hours. The smoke from all the fighting, the gun smoke and the cannon fire is so thick that you can't see very far. And the stories that they tell as they're wandering along the road trying to make it back, that you pop up through the smoke and there are just groups of soldiers periodically you run into. So there's a group of British soldiers who they meet. As our 5th Company soldier says, we had not retreated a quarter of a mile before we were fired upon by a party of the enemy, while the enemy on our rear were playing us with their artillery. Our men fought with more than Roman courage, I am convinced would have stand until we were shot down to a man. We forced the advance party, which first attacked us, to give way. As they're making their way through, they arrive at a swamp and a creek, so the Gowanus Creek, which is now the Gowanus Canal, one of the most polluted sites in America. And because it's in the middle of downtown Brooklyn, it is some of the most expensive real estate in the city. They need to try to find their way across it. Smallwood, by this point, has had the opportunity to watch. In his dispatch back to the Maryland officials, he describes, there remained no other prospect but to surrender or attempt to cross this marsh or creek where no person had ever been known to cross. We got passage down to the side of a marsh, seldom waded over, says our 5th Company soldier, which we passed and then swam a narrow river, all the time exposed to the fire of the enemy. Samuel Smith, who's a young captain from Baltimore, he later goes on to be a senator and congressman, and the person who organizes the defense of Baltimore in the War of 1812. He talked about how he took the company through the marsh until they were stopped by the mill of a dam, so at the mill pond where it gets deeper. It was too deep for the men to ford. I and a sergeant swam over and got 2 slabs of wood into the water, on which we ferried over all who could not swim. It's a chaotic scene. They are being attacked as this is going on. It's deep. They have prisoners who they are trying to bring with them along the way. There are soldiers who drown. There are prisoners who drown. One of the officers later tells his story to his children, which they remember, about how he almost drowned, but somebody pulls him up. Half the regiment is able to escape across this, including the 5th Company and the 8th Company, Samuel Smith's company. But before the rest have a chance to get across, another large contingent of British soldiers has arrived, and there's no time. They can't get across. They're going to have to find a new way off the battlefield. Gist writes, we were then left with only 5 companies of our battalion, so half the men, when the enemy returned. After a warm and close engagement for nearly 10 minutes, our troops became so disordered, we were under the necessity of retreating to a piece of woods on our right. We formed and we made a second attack, but being overpowered by numbers and surrounded on all sides by at least 20,000 men, not quite, but pretty close, we were pushed back in much confusion. The impracticability of forcing through such a formidable body of troops rendered it the height of rashness and imprudence to risk the lives of our remaining party in a third attempt, and it became necessary for us to endeavor to effect our escape in the best manner we possibly could. And this is the stand we now think of as the stand of the Maryland 400. There's another account that says that they make 6 charges against the enemy. It's hard to know if that's true. I think 2 is probably a more reasonable number. And the reason I think it's the more reasonable number is this, and this to me is what makes the action of the Marylanders as impressive as it is. What they've just done is among the hardest things that a group of soldiers in the Revolution in 18th century combat can do. They mount a charge, and they're pushed back. That's okay, that's fine. But then after they're pushed back, they're able to reform themselves and mount a second charge successfully, not a second charge. They get pushed back again, but they still manage to pull this off. This is really hard to do. So think about it for a second. You've got 600 or 800 soldiers who you need to try to organize. If everyone's not moving in sync, people can't maneuver themselves right. You're going to have people running into each other. You're going to have people pointing the wrong way, guys walking the wrong direction. This is what the Marylanders spent their time training on in Maryland. They spent 6 months doing this, which is, I mean, maybe it's not a lot of training to send somebody to war with now, but in 1776, it's more training than most of the rest of the Continental Army has. So they're able to reform themselves under fire and mount a second charge. That's a really hard thing to do. And it speaks to something, it's a little hard to put our finger on exactly what's going on. But there's clearly a lot of resolve among these soldiers. When we talk about motivations, why people are in the Army, why they fight, we usually think of their enlistment motivations, why they have joined the Army in the first place, which is important. But the reason that people join the Army is not the same as necessarily as why they stay in a battle. There are plenty of opportunities during the Revolutionary War for people to retreat. You don't want to be the last person left standing when everybody else retreats. So the goal is to understand this. The goal is to not be the last one there. But if you had faith that the soldiers around you were going to stand, that they would be resolute in the battle, you're more likely to stand there. And clearly, among the Marylanders, there's a great deal of trust with who they are fighting with. It also speaks to the leadership of the officer corps. Again, none of them have any real military experience. None of them have much idea of what they should be doing or what to expect as they begin this adventure. And they clearly have the ability to rally their men. We know that officers would appeal to soldiers. They would remind them, you're representing Maryland, you're representing your hometown. They would tell them, the men who fight bravely today will be remembered back home. The men who do not fight bravely will also be remembered back home. And we know that, and people talk about this, how they begin to waver in battle, and the thought of the embarrassment of what people at home would know helps keep them standing there. And it's a hard thing to do, and let's not mistake ourselves. You're standing there in a line, maybe not a perfect line, but certainly you're standing there in a line, somewhere between 100, 150 yards away, maybe closer. There's a group of guys shooting at you. And then later they're going to run at you with bayonets. Bayonet 17 or 18 inches long. It's a hard thing to do to stand there and take that. And then to mount that charge as the Marylanders do, it's a pretty remarkable thing. They take pretty heavy losses from all of this. As I said, they lose about a quarter of their troops, 256, as we know, killed or captured. If you only remember two things from tonight, the other thing I'd like you to remember is that it was not 256 killed. So of the roughly 1,000 Marylanders, it is 256 killed or captured, and we don't know how many were killed and how many were captured. And we unfortunately don't really know who any of those soldiers were. We have small numbers of them who we can identify as being killed, about 70 who we know who were captured and then later returned in prisoner exchanges. But we don't really know much more than that. This is the losses broken down by company. And you can see which companies take the heavy losses. Those are the companies that make that famous last stand. And they're losing 60, 70, almost 80% of their men. William McMillan says, "My brother and I, and 50 or 60 of us was taken. The Hessians broke the butts of our guns over their cannon, robbed us of everything we had, lit their pipes with our money, gave us nothing to eat for 5 days, and only then biscuits from on board ships, blue as indigo, full of bugs and rotten." Most of the people, we suspect that most of the men who are lost are probably prisoners rather than people who are killed in combat. It's just sort of an educated guess. About 70 of them we know come home in prisoner exchanges. The other thing we know is that the death rate among Americans captured at the Battle of Brooklyn, that first winter of the war, the death rate is about 50%. So we can assume perhaps 150 total Marylanders were captured. We can only identify a handful of people who are killed at the battle. Edward Vesey, the captain of the 7th Independent Company, Daniel Bowie and Joseph Butler of the 4th Company, and William Sands, who was also killed at the infighting. His papers make their way back home to Annapolis somehow. We're not sure. One of the others who is lost is William Sterrett, who's a 19-year-old, commanded the 3rd Company. And the reports back to Maryland initially say that he has died. And it inspires an anonymous friend to publish this tribute to him, this poem in the Maryland Gazette in September, a couple weeks after the battle. In fact, Sterrett was still alive, though as a prisoner of war. Determining who was dead and who had been captured was a real challenge in the first days, really the first weeks after the battle. It's a very informal process. There's not a lot of administrative structures to handle this. Smallwood gets a return, gets some numbers, he sends them back to Maryland, and he complains that the British won't tell him which privates and which enlisted soldiers they captured. Mordecai Gist writes later, the Maryland Battalion has lost 259 men, amongst whom are 12 officers. Who of them are killed and who are prisoners is not yet certain. The Sterrett family probably learns the battle's result before they hear any news from William or specifically about him. And so in the days following the battle, we know that they're anxiously waiting, his friends in Baltimore, his family in Baltimore and Annapolis. The family was close with Mordecai Gist. He would soon marry William's sister, Mary, called Polly. Samuel Sterrett, William's brother, wrote to Gist, hoping for more information, telling how they had come to believe that Sterrett had died in battle, after hearing the account from several gentlemen of credit, as he says. They were very grateful to hear from Gist that William remained alive, though as a prisoner. Permit a friend and a partaker of the distress of a much dejected family to offer the most sincerest thanks to the agreeable intelligence and the consolation that you were so kind to communicate, writes Samuel to Gist. And Polly includes a letter of the poem to pass on to her brother, and sending her compliments to Gist, who she marries in early 1778. So there we are. It's the end of the battle. The battle is over. And unfortunately, it doesn't leave the Americans in really great position. They've managed to get off the battlefield with the army sort of intact. They've lost a great deal of men. But they're safe. The camp where they are is very well fortified. And the British, at the end of the day, the Battle of Brooklyn takes most of the day. And at the end of the fighting, the British stop. They sort of advance to the edge of the American fortifications, and they take a break. The British officers, William Howe, who's the commander of the British forces, later takes a lot of criticism for this, that he doesn't immediately pursue. Howe has probably made the right decision, though. For one thing, his soldiers have been on their feet for 24 hours. They've made a midnight march. They fought an extensive amount of combat. They also are facing a particularly well-fortified group of Americans. And the other thing to understand is within the British leadership, the ghosts of the Battle of Bunker Hill haunt them for years to come. So at Bunker Hill, the British advance up the hill. This is in May of 1775. They march up the hill while the Americans fire upon them from the top. And the British just keep on marching up because they're sure the Americans are going to see these rows of red-coated soldiers and they're going to run away. And the Americans don't. And they eventually run out of ammunition. They have to withdraw. The British take horrible casualties at Bunker Hill. And it leads them to be a little bit more cautious for the rest of the war. The other reason that Howe doesn't pursue the Americans is because he doesn't think he has to. They've just put on a pretty poor performance in this battle. They've been routed and they've run off the field. And sure, they're safe in their camp for now, but the British control the river. They have the largest armada. I read somewhere it's the largest group of soldiers, group of ships between the Spanish Armada and D-Day. I don't know if that's true, but I think it gives us a sense of how many British ships there are. The British control the river. They're not particularly worried. And then the next day it rains. The weather is terrible. Smallwood later complains that they've hauled the Marylanders who've just done the best of the fighting. And everybody can see that the Marylanders had done the best of the fighting. There are reports from witnesses from other states. And he says that they've sent them out and they've been doing the most work, digging new trenches, digging new reinforcements. And so on the night of the August 28th to the 29th, the Americans finally decide that they're going to withdraw. They're going to try to go under the cover of darkness. And they begin ferrying back across the East River into Manhattan. And before they can get everybody back, the sun begins to rise. And this is a disaster because they're traveling back and forth in little boats. And the British have major warships just sitting at anchor right next to them. And as the sun comes up, it reveals that this incredibly thick fog, so thick you can't see more than 20 yards away, they say, has descended on the entire area. And it lets them get everybody back to Manhattan. And it's like something from a movie. It is something from a movie, right? This is Dunkirk, right? This is the American Dunkirk. It's the end of a terrible loss, and they sort of under the cover of the weather, they managed to sneak everybody back without really losing anybody. It doesn't really avail the Americans very much. The British land 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later in Manhattan. They push the Americans back with almost no resistance, gradually pushing them out of New York. They fight a battle in White Plains, north of the city, at the end of October, where the Americans fight well but lose and take heavy casualties. By the winter, by November, the Americans are out of New York. They won't be back there until the end of 1783. They spend the rest of 1776, beginning of 1777, on the run through New Jersey. They win at Princeton and Trenton, but otherwise, that whole first year of the war is a pretty terrible, dispiriting situation. Most of many of the American prisoners begin to get returned in that winter. As I said, there's a 50% death rate, but at least 70 men from Maryland come back. The British don't really have anything to do with them. They had not prepared to take so many soldiers. They don't really have enough food for themselves. So the Americans are in pretty horrible conditions. They're in makeshift jails. They're on prison ships in the harbor. They're not getting fed. They have no cover from the weather. Some of them, the Americans are impressed or perhaps join British Army units as a way to escape the prison ships. William McMillan writes about how he and his brother and a group of others get taken to Halifax into Nova Scotia, where there's a major British military facility. He says, we were there till the next spring. We don't know why they take them to Halifax. Perhaps New York is just crowded and they take them away. We do know that the British have a group of soldiers who they raise, of Continental Americans, who they raise based out of Halifax. And it's quite possible that McMillan and his brother and these other men have volunteered to fight in this group. It's a Scottish group, and it's a way to get out of the prison ships. And I think it's really hard to blame anybody for that. But by the spring, they escape. 10 of us run away from Halifax. We were 10 weeks in the wilderness, sometimes with nothing to eat for days, but the moss that grows on the rocks in the bays, sometimes shellfish and snails. We suffered everything but death. They too do something that sounds like it's from a movie. They walk their way from Halifax around the Bay of Fundy, around the coast to northern Maine, to a little town called Machias, where they meet up with some militia soldiers who take them by boat to Portland and then eventually to Boston. Samuel McMillan, the older brother, is sick and can't immediately move on, but eventually both of them rejoin the Army and they fight together in a unit from Massachusetts for the next couple of years. They fight in a Massachusetts unit until 1778, at which point they find themselves at the same place as the Maryland lines. This is the first time they've been with the Marylanders. And William McMillan takes the opportunity. He wanders over. He finds Smallwood, so he says. He finds Smallwood. Smallwood promises him a commission as a lieutenant and grants him a discharge and lets McMillan spend the rest of the war in Baltimore as a recruiter. So McMillan says. He later has a little bit of trouble proving this, but ultimately manages to convince the Pension Bureau that this is what happens. The reason we have such a wonderful account from McMillan about what happens to him, so many great details, and I'm giving you just a small snippet of it, is he has to write a very detailed and lengthy account to some politicians who he's connected with, who have some influence, and he can try to help him get his pension through. Which is unfortunate for him, but it's really fortunate for us because we learn so many of these wonderful details from something like that. So the war doesn't end in 1776, of course. It lasts another 7 years. Most of the combat ends in 1781 with the surrender at Yorktown, though the Marylanders aren't really at Yorktown. Most of them are still in the Carolinas. The Maryland line spends 1782, 1783 in South Carolina, keeping their eye on the British, who stay in Charleston for most of 1783. There are at least 60 soldiers in the Maryland line who had been in the Battle of Brooklyn, so they served the entire war. Some of them are in the Navy. At least one of them is a soldier who was captured at Brooklyn. Peter McNaughton was captured at Brooklyn, is impressed into the British Army, escapes in 1779, and then re-enlists that year and continues the rest of the war. He lived somewhere around western side of Maryland, possibly Carroll, possibly Washington. It's a little vague. He just sort of disappears after the war. We don't really know much about him. Those who survive the hazards of the battlefield often fall victim to illness during this time. So the Marylanders keep losing soldiers. By the end of 1776, there's a really small number of them left. But the ones who do survive, and most of them do survive. They're just sick. They have to go home and they recover. And most of them re-enlist. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of Smallwood soldiers re-enlisted at the end of 1776. And they agreed to fight for another 3 years. They stay on through some of the worst of the fighting. Most of them get out of the war, out of the Army at the end of 1779. They've done their part. And so when the war, attention focuses to the South and some of the really brutal fighting, a lot of the guys who have started the war with Smallwood, they're gone. But their legacy remains. When Maryland expands the number of regiments it has, so they get from 1 regiment to 7, and requires a huge number of officers and non-commissioned officers, so the sergeants and the corporals. And the only people who have any experience are these men who just fought with Smallwood, who fought for that horrible campaign in 1776. And they provide veteran leadership. They are the ones who form the core of what becomes, now I thought this was just home state boosterism, but the Maryland line really is one of the best units in the Continental Army. And the core of it is this group of veterans who enlist and they fight in 76. They survive the Battle of Brooklyn. If they weren't there during the Southern campaign, the people who fought in the South learned from them. They learned how to be a soldier from them. The story of Maryland soldiers, of course, doesn't end in 1776, doesn't end in 1783. The men wounded in combat have trouble. Some of them find themselves at the end of the war, terrible economic circumstances. Even some of the men from wealthier families are in terrible situations. They've lost many years where they could have been establishing themselves establishing their wealth. And they find themselves perhaps rich in status, but certainly poor in cash. There are certainly some who do well. Some of the rich men do well. Samuel Smith is one of the richest men in the state. William Smallwood certainly is. But others are able to gain a foothold in the gentry from their service in the Army. People who start out as sort of perhaps the fringes of the middle class, manage to get themselves through merit commissions as officers, and that gives them sort of a boost into life. We know later that even as they are surviving the hard economic times, they're surviving their own personal trauma from the war, that the soldiers do build and maintain relationships with each other. There are pension applications, so filed in the 1810s to 1830s, 1840s, where they will file depositions for each other. 30, 40, 50 years later, they're still in contact with some of their comrades. You can say, oh yes, I fought with him. We were in these battles all together. There are some soldiers who actually have trouble getting pensions because they've found themselves in Ohio. They're not near anybody they know, and they don't know anyone around who can help testify to their service. Some of them ultimately don't even get their pensions that they're probably entitled to. Nevertheless, despite the successes and the hardships, it's really clear Maryland's recruits of 1776, they shaped the state's lines for the rest of the war, and they themselves are shaped by their service. I could have showed you this lovely picture. The stories that I've told today, they come from the research that we've compiled as part of Finding the Maryland 400, our project documenting these soldiers. We have written biographies of all of these soldiers. They're available. You can find them online at msa.maryland400.com. You can click on our QR code, which will take you to a page about our project. We are in the process of publishing a book, which will include all of this research, all of the biographies. It really is telling the story of Maryland soldiers, telling the story of the Maryland line through the lives of the soldiers who enlisted in 1776. Publication of the book is dependent entirely on outside funding. There's no state funding for a project like this. So there are brochures that I've distributed. The website is there. I hope you will consider making a contribution to help support the project. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm glad you all could be here.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Owen?
It's just not a great question probably, but how did the survivors who were so sick get back to Maryland, get back to Annapolis from New York?
So that's actually a great question. And some of the things that I'm actually most interested by are those kind of the logistics of it all. We don't know. Oh, I should say no. We don't know specifically how they did it, but we know that they are running wagons back and forth up and down the road. Because there are guys who end up in the hospital in Philadelphia, but there are also guys who end up in the hospital in Annapolis. And we know that there are wagons traveling. They bring people's baggage around. One of our soldiers reports that in 1777 he's a wagon driver for a while, and one of the officers lets him carry all of his possessions with him.
I can imagine them marching 20 miles a day when they have dysentery and
Yeah.
or starving
And-
to death.
I don't want to imagine.
No,
Yeah.
it's a tough thing.
The things that they survived, it's
And-
amazing.
It is. And these are people who would have been used to walking a lot more than we are. Even people who have horses walk a lot because getting your horse together and getting out to go riding, that's a lot of work. Horses are expensive, so most people don't even have them. And so people are going to walk 6, 8, 10 miles. That's not necessarily a huge thing that they're doing.
I heard that the towns in Carroll County were laid out within a day's walk of each other for that very reason.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'll believe that. And even if not intentionally, then certainly just that's how it could have easily have developed. And so people who are used to marching, they talk about it in their pensions. They tell stories about it, how awful it is. For one thing, in beginning of 1706, they all have shoes, and they buy shoes in October. They send some of the officers to Philadelphia to buy shoes. They buy 1,000 pair of shoes and they bring them back. But for a lot of the war, they don't have shoes at all. These guys are marching barefoot. And one of the soldiers talks about, we fought in this battle, we fought in that battle, plus all of the marching, which is too tedious for me to even talk about. In the Civil War, where there are a lot more personal accounts from the Civil War because the literacy rates are so much higher. There's an account that I've read from a Union soldier who talks about how you can't understand what it was like to be in the Army during the Civil War. And I think the same is true of the Revolution. Until you have found yourself waking up, marching, because you've been marching asleep, and you don't know what's happened, and you go back to sleep and just continue marching. So if you haven't done that, you can't understand what they were doing. Yeah.
In Carroll County, there's a small little town called Smallwood. I do not know if it's named after him or not, but it's between Eldersburg and Gambrel and.
Interesting. I did not know that.
It's very small.
Smallwood, him, of course, isn't the only person from his family.
Yeah,
There have been
exactly.
Smallwoods since the 1650s to the 1660s. But I'll say that they're all in Charles County. It's a long way from up here.
From Carroll County.
So if there's something named Smallwood, there's a decent chance that he was the name inspired by him.
If you have, for the group, any interest in Maryland's regiment, apart and distinct from here, there's a great book called Washington's Immortals, which is everything you ever wanted to know about the Maryland line, but you forgot to ask.
Yeah.
It's an excellent book.
No, he tells a really good story, and he draws very heavily on some of the work we did. He doesn't mention it, but he does draw. If you look in the sources, you can see that he used our material pretty heavily. So we claim that as some of our work.
And as a native Marylander, when I got done reading it, I was pretty proud because, quite frankly, it's considered to be like you said, the
Yeah.
best regiment in the entire Continental Army. Part of his personal guard, his shock troops, they were all Marylanders.
Yeah, and the way we know that is because in 1780, the war shifts to the south. And Washington sends an army to South Carolina to try to bail out the Americans who are down there. And he picks men from Maryland and from Delaware. If there are any Delaware folks in here, I will say I apologize for not mentioning Delaware more. Whenever we talk about the Marylanders, the soldiers from Delaware are there. They fight with the Marylanders alongside them the whole war. Delaware only manages one regiment, so they don't have other soldiers to fight with, so they fight with the Marylanders. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if you'll permit me to brag a little bit about the rifle companies. Speaking of marching, we celebrated it in Frederick last month. But they marched 550 miles from Frederick to
Yes, they did.
Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
in 22 days.
Yeah, they must have been more or less running.
They
Yeah.
were backwoodsmen.
Yeah.
They're used to it.
Big, tall, rangy guys. Yeah. Dr. Boucher?
Owen, you do a phenomenal job. I love the work you do. When is Hollywood going to make the movie on this? Because this is.
Funnily enough, 6 or 8 years ago, there was some talk about a movie script about the Maryland 400 was allegedly floating around, and supposedly Sir Patrick Stewart, was interested in it. I'm not particularly well connected to Hollywood, so can't tell you much more than
Is
that.
anyone in Maryland connected with Hollywood? Because we need to sell this. This is phenomenal.
Well, it's the 250th is coming, and I think that will help
Yeah, that's
change attention. The revolution hasn't gotten talked about a lot. Since the bicentennial, we've had the Civil War gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. The Civil War happens here, and the Civil War is a lot easier to study because we know a lot more about them because they wrote letters. And the War of 1812, Maryland's big military moment, got plenty of attention at its bicentennial. So hopefully that the 250th will inspire a little bit more conversation about Maryland. And I would say both from the military side, but also just from what's happening in Maryland politically. Because Maryland is not like the rest of the country. Things happen in Maryland that are different than everywhere else. I think that's a different lecture. I won't. I'm standing between you and your dinner, so we won't talk about that. But it's it's a really fascinating topic as well. So we can talk about that kind of thing too. Yes, sir.
So I'm actually originally from Long Island, and I've seen monuments when I lived there. And for us who lived on Long Island, it was always the Battle of Long Island, not the Battle of Philly. And so for me, as a commissioner for Carroll County, I know from my reading that a number of people from Frederick County were members of these regiments. And obviously part of Frederick County became Carroll County in 1837. And so are you able to determine which individuals who lived in what was then Frederick County became or would have been citizens of Carroll County?
Not really. And we tried because there's a company raised in Frederick in Western Maryland. It's actually there's a significant number of Germans in that, just because that's who's living out in the mountains. And there's a company that company's based out of Frederick. There's a company raised officially in Baltimore. Actually, two companies raised officially in Baltimore. But we know that the recruiters are ranging well out into the countryside in Baltimore County and out into the areas, the parts of Baltimore County that are now Carroll County. And it's just so hard to determine where any of these people lived, even if you can trace them to a particular county. And it's not always easy to connect them back to a county after the war. But if you can trace them to a county, we don't really know precisely enough where they live to tell, are they in the Carroll part, or are they in the Frederick part, or are they in the Baltimore part. So, yeah. But there are definitely some guys who are from what's now Carroll County, but we can't quite tell you who they are.
Thank you.
The other thing I'll say about the Battle of Long Island, what I've learned, the way it was described to me from the folks who run the old Stone House, which is the historic site in Brooklyn, which interprets this. She says, Brooklyn is where the battle happens. Long Island is where your grandparents live.
Okay, so we just want to say thank you. I also want to say thank you to the Westminster branch of the Sons of the American Revolution for sponsoring the talk tonight, to the Tawnytown branch of Carroll County Public Library and Lisa Pecker for helping us out, to Maryland State Delegate Boucher.
New member of the SAR. I just really.
And Commissioner Joe Vigliotti. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight and for listening to this. We have talks scheduled throughout this year and then into 2026. So we look forward to seeing everybody again. Thank you so much. The next, I gave that earlier. I don't have to say anymore. It's over there.
We have cooking in Maryland next Thursday.
Yeah, that's right, Cooking in Maryland. But you have to sign up for that one, and it's limited seating, so
Yes.
sign up now.
But you get to eat
You get to
and you
eat,
get a cookbook.
and it's 2 hours, and so it should be really good.
There's no is there a cost?
The cookbook is 40, right? Yeah, it's $40 for cookbook.
Just for the book, but not for the program.
No, it's all included, that's all, she signs the book and everything.
All right.
Have a great evening, and be careful going home.
I gotta get up.
I have it on the back.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
See you, buddy.
One more question.
Yeah.